Hey, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started here. I'll start with a few introductions. Welcome and thank you for joining the State Water Resources Control Board's Water Quality Fee Stakeholder Meeting. This meeting is being held virtually through Zoom and the webcast platforms, and also being recorded. My name is David Ceccarelli, and I'm the Fee and Revenue Branch within the Division of Administrative Services here at the State Water Board. Today, we have many of our fee branch staff working behind the scenes to ensure that you experience as few participation bumps as possible. If any time throughout this event you find that you're having any difficulties, please email feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. That email address is also on the agenda handout. Also joining me today to review the budget cost drivers is Izzy Abeda, who is one of the water quality fee managers in the unit. Individuals attending via Zoom, please use the raise the hand function if you'd like to ask a question or provide a comment. If you're joining us through webcast, you can also submit a comment or ask a question by emailing the email on the screen, which is feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. I do want to mention that in the past, there have been some delays in the podcast through the webcast. Therefore, through this meeting, staff will pause through some of the times just so the listeners can catch up through the podcast. Again, we thank you for joining us virtually today. We thank you for your patience as we moved to this 100% virtual meeting space. Again, we're doing our best to ensure everyone can participate in an effective manner. So let's just go over just a few meeting guidelines. Remember to use the handouts that were sent to you via email. If you do not have the handouts, don't worry. We will be sharing the documents on the screen. You can request a copy of the documents after the meeting, or the handouts are posted on our Water Board's fee webpage. Again, just remember, if you have any technical issues, please email us at the feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. And then please mute yourself when you're not speaking. So before I go over the agenda, I'm going to pass this along to John Russell, who's the Deputy Director of the Division of Administrative Services, and he's going to provide some opening comments.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, this will be brief on my part. I just wanted to welcome all of you and thank you again for participating in these meetings. Like David said, I know it's not ideal, and we do really want to get back to in-person meetings with this remote component so that you don't have to travel if you don't want to. We're working towards that. We're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. And then before I forget, I want to say what I say every meeting, that this is our initial meeting. The numbers are a little bit squishy yet. That's just the way the budget process works, and David and Itzy will go through that and explain that. And things will firm up as we go into the summer and through the budget process a little bit more. But what I really wanted to say is that if you have any questions or concerns about any of this at any point in the whole process, feel free to email or call David or myself, and we can work through those. So with that, I'll hand it over to David and we'll get underway.
Thank you, John. If we can have the agenda put up, please. So the second item on our agenda is we're going to go over the waste discharge permit fund budget cost drivers. And this attachment is again based on the January governor's proposed budget that was released in January. We'll be going over the program budget detail. And then at that point, after we kind of field questions and kind of go over the financial side of the program, Karen Mogus will lead a discussion regarding cost of compliance discussion for the Division of Water Quality. And then at that point, after that, we'll just have an open discussion and then talk about next steps. So next slide, please. So what we're reflecting here is I just kind of want to briefly talk about the top table here, and then I'm going to pass it on to Itzy, and then Itzy can go over the budget cost drivers here. So what we're looking at here is our budget allocation from what we refer to as our fee setting budget in 21-22. So when we went to the board, our fee setting budget was basically $174.4 million. And then what's in our, what we refer to as, which is in the January proposed budget, again, that was released here on January 10th, which is $175.8 million, which is basically a net difference of $1.4 million, which is, again, less than 1% change in the program cost since our fee setting budget. So I'm going to pass this on to Itzy, and then Itzy will go over some of the costs, the three cost drivers that are driving that $1.4 million, or again, the less than 1% change in the waste discharge permit fund.
Thanks, David. I'm not sure if my visuals really well, but I'm going to do just that. I'll present what's shown here. So in the first table, we do see that we have the fee setting budget from last year, rounding to just about 174 million, followed by the fee setting budget for this year for 22-23 at just about 175 million. This difference shows about, less than a 1% difference from last year to this year. So going down to the second table, we see, well, what's going into the first table. So the second table shows the primary cost drivers that explain the difference that's shown above. So first, we showed 2.24% for the control section adjustment. This is another way of saying that this is state operations, which is healthcare, salaries, and retirement. And then the next, we see pro rata, which is a negative percentage of 0.05%. And this covers costs from other agencies that provide services to the water board. So its services rendered by Department of Finance and Cal HR, which provides training to state employees. And this year, we actually find that pro rata went down in comparison to prior year. Pro rata went down due to a recalculation of a prior year estimate, which then resulted in a reduction of pro rata. And then lastly, we see here section 4.05, which is an ongoing expenditure reduction adjustment. And that's shown here to be about a negative 1.55%. To give a little bit more context on this section 4.05, Department of Finance directed all state agencies, including the Water Board, to reduce our overall budget by 5%. And as a part of this direction, our budget office found savings in operating expenses and equipment for things like printing, postage, and travel. And the savings contributed to approximately $2.7 million in savings. So with that explanation, I'll hand it back to David if there are any further questions regarding these numbers.
So thank you, Itzy. So again, kind of looking at the budget cost drivers, currently there are no BCPs in the Jan 10th budget that impact the waste discharge permit fund. So again, no BCPs driving any of the costs. Going back to that control section, which is the ongoing expenditure reductions, this was a drill from the Department of Finance, not just for the water board, but for all state departments. We were asked to look at ways to find savings in the overall budget of and try to reduce our budget by 5%. And so as we have these discussions for our stakeholder meetings, not just for water quality, but when you look at water rights, drinking water, ELAP, there will definitely be some savings based on the expenditures. And again, as Itzy mentioned, the majority of savings was found in what we refer to as operating expenses and equipment. So, any equipment that we were able to find some savings, or travel cost and some like administrative stuff for like printing and postage and things like that. So again, the net effect at this point is that the difference again between what we set fees last year and then what's in the governor's proposed budget is a net difference of about 1.4 million, which is again less than 1%. So at this point, let's move to the next slide. So this is basically detailing the total revenue here that's needed to cover our budgetary expenditures. And so the first thing I wanted to highlight is, well, first of all, I just kind of want to walk through the spreadsheet here. And as you can see, what column A is all of the waste discharge permit fund programs that are our fee setting programs. So they're listed there. What I wanted to highlight next is column B and what we refer to as our fee setting budget. So our fee setting budget is 172.8, which is approximately about $3 million less than what's in the governor's proposed budget. And that's a result is, and we've done this in the last few years, is because we are adjusting our cannabis revenue to meet our cannabis expenditures, or the cannabis expenditures to meet our cannabis revenue. And so as you can see there, under the cannabis, if you were to look at what the cannabis fee setting budget is, which is $6.8 million, and then our revenue forecast is $6.8 million. So we are matching those two numbers. The reason we're driving it down by $3 million is because the cannabis program authority in the budget is about $3 million higher. And again, we don't have the revenue to match that. So, we take savings protocols and procedures in place by holding positions or moving those positions to other kind of non-fee paying programs. And as a result, it allows us to have some savings there, and we're able to match the revenue. So again, our fee setting budget is roughly about $3 million less than what's in the governor's proposed budget. Moving along, what C is this is our 22-23 revenue forecast based on today's data. So basically, if we were to generate invoices right now for next fiscal year, we're looking to generate roughly about $169.7 million, which basically is a shortfall of about $3.1 million in the fund. And so some of the factors that drive our revenue forecast, and as John mentioned, again, it's early in the process. This is our first meeting in the fee setting process. We're still trying to finalize revenue reports. Our projected revenues based on prior year and current year invoicing, permit data in our water quality databases. We evaluate applications and other projects that may be entering or terminating the permitting process. We also review the positive revenue reported by our accounting office. And so again, as this being the first meeting in the fee setting process, we do estimate that we do project that our revenue estimates are subject to change. So as of right now, we're again shy by about $3.1 million. Now, I will say what's driving that in the total fund is our revenue estimates for the 401 CERT program, which are basically about $2 million. For the water quality certification program, it is definitely a unique revenue-driven program compared to the other water quality programs, since the majority of the revenue is generated from application revenue, where the other programs are mainly invoice-based revenue. So water board staff are in the process for reviewing projects, applications to better assess the estimates of revenue. And we do anticipate having a more accurate projection in the upcoming months. So what column D is basically B minus C. So it's our fee setting budget minus our revenue forecast. And that gets us to the $3.1 million. What our fiscal year, what E is the fiscal year 22-23 total adjusted revenue, which is, again, matches B basically. And so to get there, basically, this is the percentage changes to meet revenue to meet expenditures. So that's what F is. So the average program percentage change to support program expenditures is column F. So the majority outside of the 401 CERT, the majority of them range from 0% to about 2.2%. So again, looking at this just in a vacuum, if I need to generate revenue just to cover program costs for fiscal year 22-23 based on all the data I know right now, this is basically what the percentage changes would be for the program. Now moving into what G is. So again, we're still working on revenue reports and evaluating our fund reserve. But what I wanted to do was provide an example of knowing that all of our funds need some type of fund reserve. And so for this fund, if we're shooting for about a 5%, what I've done here is provide an example of what the revenue adjustments would be based on having a 5% reserve. So looking at these numbers, here's the additional revenue that we would need to generate a 5% reserve. So column H, which is G minus C, basically means that we need an $11.8 million. So what this number is building a 5% reserve plus covering our cost for 22-23. So as you can see over in column H, those are basically the average program percentage changes to adjust to a 5% fund reserve. And so they range from outside of course, the water quality CERT program, they range from about 5% to about 7%, about 7.3%. So again, I wanted to, again, kind of illustrate a couple of things. One, column F is illustrating that what the percentage of change of revenue would be needed to cover our program expenditures. And then column I is also covering our program expenditures, including building a 5% reserve into the fund. This is basically looking at it as if we're starting to build this reserve at a zero balance fund reserve. So looking at the fund, if I was to look at it and say, okay, we're at 0% fund reserve and I need to build 5%, that's basically what I is illustrating there, including covering program cost. So at this point, I would definitely like to, open it up to any questions that anyone might have. And I believe, Bob Gore, your hand is raised.
Yeah, yes, it is. I can't start my video for whatever reason. I'm locked out. Anyway, you don't need to see a picture of me. It would be helpful to, in the future, with attachment 1, compare the full expense budget, that is, the reserve is included, as opposed to what's called, which I think is an artifice, that frankly, is the fee setting budget, because the fee payers, some of us on this call, pay for the reserve as well as everything else. So if you have another column in the future that has fee setting budget, and then whatever you want to call it, full budget, because it's like being promised something for Christmas, and then you kind of only get half of it, you get real disappointed. So anyway, if you would do that. Also, very quickly, as long as we're on the subject of data, in the future, could you please provide us with what you used to do for the WDPF? Oh, well, anyway, I have them here to show to my camera, but in previous workshops, we've had staffing by program, some really nice charts, and then we've had expenditures by program by year. So since we've done that in the past, if we could do that again, it would be helpful. Also, for example, 10 years ago in FY12-13, the full budget was 101.6 million. It's gone up by 80 million in a decade. It would be good to know what additional services or programs have been added that account for that increase over the last decade. Also, a third request, and I'll put this in writing for the next meeting. We would like to, that is some of the stakeholders, put together a general fund request, if not for a May revise, at least for next year. So we'd like to have a breakout, and this is concurrent with what we're working on cost of compliance, a breakout on what the approximate expenditures are for planning, enforcement, and data programs. That I think is a statewide benefit and would be appropriate for general funds. So those are my requests. Sorry for shoehorning in a couple of irrelevant ones. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Just to reply, definitely on things like the staffing breakdown for the staffing expenditures by program. We have shown those in the past.
Yeah.
Currently our accounting office is working on, building those reports, working through Fizcal, and working on closing the books for fiscal year 2021 that we are in. Once we are able to get that data and build those reports, it's definitely something that's on my to-do list to share. Just at this time, they would be estimates, and I hesitate to show them just because I don't have like accurate data, but we definitely have shown them in the past, and we're definitely kind of working to get there, and we eventually will be showing that type of data. Regarding, again, kind of driving what you've just mentioned about, 10 years ago, the program being $100 million program, and now it being close to, $175 million program. That information we did show at the board meeting in September. There were kind of multiple charts that broke down all the different programs, and what was driving all that cost, basically, kind of, and then so reflecting all the BCPs that have come into play. Also highlighted the programs that were reduced subsidies like general fund, and then subsidized with fee authority. What we can do is we could kind of relook at those charts, and then post them back on our webpage, or put them up on our webpage for stakeholders to go and look at. And if needed, of course, at our next stakeholder meeting, we could look at building in those discussions at the next stakeholder meeting also.
Great.
So I think there are definitely some questions, some hands up. So Megan, do you want to the next person in the line? And maybe it's Karen.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Karen Cowan, Casco's Executive Director. Two quick questions. One, for the proposed 5% increase to fund a reserve, if that's targeting a 5% reserve and fees go up 5% this year to fund that reserve, I presume that next year fees would go down 5% once the fund is funded?
So to answer your question, so again, this is an example. So for example, if I'm looking at the fund currently and it has a 0% fund reserve, and I'm definitely, all of our funds, we do need to have some type of fund reserve, and we're for majority of the time, the WDPF has had around about a 5% reserve. So this example reflects what it would take to build a 5% reserve. And then, but moving into the next fiscal year, for example, if our reserve is less than 5%, then staff would propose an option to either, do we keep it below that 5%, or do we adjust it to generate the revenue to maintain a 5% reserve? If it's greater than 5%, Then there's also the option that we go to the board and say, you know, do we want to keep the reserve greater than 5%, or do we want to take some measures to help reduce that and offset program costs by using some of that reserve?
Okay, so I guess that's just a flag. I would flag for next year if that were to go through to make, because if things go up 5%, now it's part of baseline, right? And if it was a one-time increase for that reserve, I think that's just something I'd want to look at next year.
Correct. Let me just, and then, so let me also state this also. Through our counting process, if it's determined that, you know, we get our reports and it looks like that the WDPF is in better shape, and there is a, you know, a positive amount in the reserve, or let's just say it is 5%, there's a potential not needing this increase to cover that 5%, because it could already be in there. We don't have the final expenditures and revenue reports for the prior year and the fiscal year that we're in that could determine what our fund reserve is right now.
Okay. All right. And my second question is, in the adoption hearing in September, one of the things that I believe the water board members directed was a little bit more of a report on the breakdown about recovery time for increases to the stormwater fees, for example, over SB 205, because it was presented as the new enrollees would recover that funding, but there was not an accounting of how long until that funding would be recovered and how existing permittees would be reimbursed for the time that they're fronting all the other fees for everybody, the theoretical new permittees. And it really, really, really matters for status quo, but it really matters because there's more bills that have been introduced this cycle that would increasingly compound this problem in a way bigger than SB 205 ever did. So I want to just ask about the status of that and to highlight that this is an ongoing concern for us.
Yes, no, thank you, Karen. I'm glad you brought that up. I have been working with staff. Staff is looking into, again, the number of projects that are coming in and evaluating that revenue. I don't have the exact number right now in that time frame. And I know I mentioned to you back, I think in September, that we would be looking at that also. And it did take a couple of months to kind of get to kind of evaluating it. And it basically started almost January 1, where we some reports were coming in working with the stormwater staff. So I'm going to reach back out to Patrick and some of the other stormwater staff on that. And in the next few weeks, we'll get you a response to kind of determine where we are on those new projects and you know, kind of that whole subsidy of how long we think that the number of projects will come in and start really making a determination where they're paying, you know, for the share of the program.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's Sharon Green is next up.
Good morning. Hi, Sharon Green with Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. I kind of wanted to continue the line of kind of questions and comments about the reserve proposal. I guess if I wanted to make sure I was hearing you right, that you're saying that you still don't have any data to show what level of reserves the funds are at currently. Is that correct?
That is correct. So we're not showing, normally I would say, you know, prior to Fizcal, we were able to show, of course, our fund conditions, which would show our opening budget, basically our opening reserves and opening revenues. And then we break down what the expenditures for the year are, what our revenues for the year are. And then basically all those net differences, we'd show a reserve. Currently, we don't, you know, have that data. We're getting close, and I feel comfortable that soon we'll be able to show that. But as a result, what I'm doing now is just showing an example of if I was looking at it where I had no reserve and I needed to build a 5% reserve, here is the impacts to the different programs.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess what I wanted to suggest is that maybe you consider showing some options or just I mean, to me, it seems like a dramatic assumption that there's zero reserve, given that you always have maintained reserves. And, you know, as you just said, we used to know what that level was. And now for several years, we haven't really had any data on that, but I would be kind of shocked if it's gone down to zero. So it seems like maybe proposing a gradual increase of like 1% or a couple percent, that over time, if it is depleted, could rebuild it. And that would at least give you a bridge to where you have the data, presumably, or hopefully. I just don't feel very comfortable as a fee payer kind of endorsing like, yes, you need to replenish and it's the full 5% when we have zero data. You guys at least have some data, I presume, but we don't have anything. And that just seems like I mean, it's obviously kind of a worst case scenario assumption that it sounds like you're portraying it as, and I have a hard time thinking that that's really the case. I don't know. So that would be my proposal. Think about something more gradual that maybe over time as needed, it would be a lot easier to adjust. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. I think Debbie's up next.
Sure, thanks. And thanks, David. I'm actually going to say something or something that has both embedded a question and a comment. And I just want to let you know, as I realize that you don't have a lot of control over the comment, but I thought it was probably, as it relates to fees, important to know. So the background is that both at the regional level and at the state level, I continue to hear board members make statements such as, oh, there's all this, budget excess at the state level. Can we get them together can we get some of that for water quality programs? And as we know, most everything switched over from general fund back into the fees program a while ago. So I realize that you can't really say anything to what you're asking for with budgets, but I guess my question is, and then I'll get to the comment after the question, but my question is what programs, like, for example, other than SRF type of programs, what kind of programs can the state do and say, yeah, we can fund this, that don't end up impacting our fees unless they say it's general fund and it's a one-time thing? That's where I'm a little bit uncertain, because I would like to make sure that the board members are educated that yes, they can ask, but usually it ends up being a fee increase. So that's my question in there.
Well, I kind of just looking at some of our funding overall at the water board. Of course, one of our larger programs is the underground storage tank cleanup fund, and that's subsidized by taxes at the pump and so forth, meals tax. We get some of that tax revenue, and we definitely get federal money that comes into for some of our state revolving fund programs. And of course, during times of things like drought and so forth, we definitely get general fund. So it's definitely where these programs have been authorized for fee setting programs and subsidized by the fees. So it is definitely it's a ongoing question, basically. Are there other than general fund, are there other programs out there that can help subsidize and help fund some of these programs? And those are definitely questions for the stakeholders and through working with the legislators. But again, going back, of course, I think we're all aware that there was general fund for a lot of these programs that had benefits for the entire state. As an example, like the basin planning and TM Dale programs. And again, those were, reduced and, put to the fee setting process. And that was a huge impact. It was about 25% of the time. And of course, those costs have gone up. So let me also kind of maybe have John Russell maybe touch on this. Because it's it's the ongoing question that we get, and I know Bob Gore and his group has been kind of looking at this also.
Yeah, and the question is the general fund. How can we get our hands on that? Is that correct, basically?
Well, it's how can we, so I know that water boards are advocating for trying to get a hold of some of the surplus budget and to make programs out of it. But it's a hard thing because of course you'd like to say, yes, that sounds great. Let's do some more for water quality, whatever. But the reality is that ends up being a fee-based program, not a general fund program. And I, from Fizcal, we don't do a lot of, I don't say we don't do a lot of lobbying, we don't lobby. And so it is but I think that where my comment was going is really that whole, not only just educating the stakeholders, but the education on board members and different parts is how much of that is getting said is like, yes, you can say that, but it really is an increase. And, unfortunately, most of our communities are not seeing the kind of surpluses, at least in the Central Valley, that the state is seeing. So, and they're seeing increased cost in implementing other programs. And I know that sounds like a broken record, but it's a continued true statement. So John, go take it, because it's like, how can we is there, other than them being very specific, how can, or having temporary, that's what I'm trying to figure out is, other than putting money into loan programs, which we know they can do without impacting or making a huge impact on the programs, what are some other ways, or what are some other programs that really can be general funded without becoming a fee-based program?
Yeah, really, we get this question all the time. Why is there a surplus and our fees are still going up? That general fund money is very hard for us to get, obviously. The whole budget process is confidential, but I can tell you that whenever we have a new program or an augmentation to a program, that's the first thing we do is look at what's the appropriate fund source. Is it really a benefit to the state as a whole? In which case we always advocate for general fund, or is it a specific fee payer group that's going to be, the sole beneficiary of this? So we do behind the scenes. I even though the process is confidential in general, I can tell you that we advocate very hard for general fund money when we can get it. But really, I think it really is advocacy and lobbying, to be honest with you, is talking to the legislators and saying, there's programs that we as fee payers are paying for that really are a general benefit to the state as a whole, and they should be general funded. As you know, the general fund, it ebbs and flows. Some years we have a lot, sometimes we don't have a lot. So that's always one of the fears of the legislature, is that they'll shift a lot of things back to general fund, and then the general fund money will be, there'll be an economic downturn or whatever, and they won't have the money to support those programs. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, I know, but but I really do think that's where we need to collectively work towards, is convincing the legislature that, some of these should be general funded instead of fee payer funded.
I'm like, I took enough time. I think I would just personally like to also see, and I think at least at our regional level, we can do that, but with the board members too, is making sure, and others making sure that they know that that success rate's pretty low, at least now. And it is kind of that misinterpretation of, oh, we're going after state funding. It really ends up being that local funding instead. So thank you.
Yeah, like you said, we got a lot of general fund money last year, but it was really pass-through money. It was money for infrastructure loans and grants. So it didn't really help pay for our staff. It was really for us to, we were basically wealth redistributor at that point, where we were getting the funding out to disadvantaged communities and other communities that needed to improve their wastewater infrastructure and drinking water infrastructure and things like that.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you. So before we get to, there's a few more questions through Zoom. We have some questions through the emails. So let's take those.
Okay, the first question is from Suzanne Zechiel. Her question is, can you explain why you need a fund reserve and why it needs to be 5%?
Well, first of all, let me just say that the 5% is an example. 5% is roughly about $8 million on the size of this fund. And basically for economic uncertainties, there have been times in years past where some proposal came in mid-year. And as a result, instead of going back to the stakeholders and adjusting fees for that fiscal year, we were able to use some of the reserve to cover those costs. So it's basically, again, economic uncertainties, back kind of even during when COVID, came into play and we minimized fees a couple of years ago. We took a lot of different salary saving measures, from everything from holding vacancies to whatever reserve was in the fund to help offset costs. So again, the 5% is just an example. It's not a proposal. It's just an example. Again, but when I say 5%, $8 million on a fund that's $175 million, we look at that, using that money again for economic uncertainties throughout the year. So next question, Sarah.
Okay. The next question is from Tim Johnson with the California Rice Commission. It's more of a comment. As agriculture faces a third and even more profound year of drought, I implore you to find a way to rein in these annual and excessive fee increases. I ask that you report on such actions at our next stakeholder meeting. I especially question bringing reserve levels to 5% in 1 year.
Thank you, Tim.
And there's one more question from James Hausner from CMANC. He has two questions. The first is, how are the numbers in column B arrived at? I understand the bottom line and how that is derived. I believe in prior years, we were told there isn't a relationship between issuing permits and fees. I'm interested in the water quality certification row.
So column B, of course, is our fee setting budget. And so what's in that number basically is all of our staff costs for the direct program and all their redirected costs, for example, paying for foundational programs, swamp and gamma. Although I will say for the irrigated lands program, that program is not paying for monitoring costs. So it's loaded with all the direct costs and the indirect cost, plus again, foundational programs. Looking at what our revenue forecast is in for the 401 CERT program. Again, that's looking at all the permit information that we have. And then we're also looking at like projected projects that are coming in that are, through applications. How are they, the size of the projects and how they're impacted through the 401 CERT program. So we are, again, as I mentioned earlier, it is early in the process, and the funding on the water quality CERT program is driven a lot by application revenue. So new projects that are coming in, or existing projects that may be being amended. And so we are looking at that, and we're, again, working with program staff, looking at it and all the information that we have currently. And then we're also comparing that, of course, with all of the deposits in our accounting office, and working with our accounting department to get reports so we can do that comparison. So I do anticipate that that we'll have better revenue numbers for all of our programs, but including the water quality certification program. And if there's, and I'm sorry, and then just if he has like further questions on this, please reach out to me, and we can have some discussions, and we can also include water quality program staff in those meetings for those discussions.
Yeah, he has a second question on the same
Yes.
email. What is the driver for water quality certification to need substantially more revenue than projected? I am assuming column C reflects the current fiscal year fees and the current fiscal year budget.
Yes. So the $14.5 million is reflected a lot into what our current revenue is, but we're also looking at, what the projected projects are going to be coming in for 22-23, what's in our what we refer to as our water quality databases where the permit information is put in. Again, as I mentioned, that it is early in the fiscal year, and so we're definitely kind of driving down to try to tie into that number. And as that revenue goes up, then we would anticipate that the needed revenue would of course go down. I will say in some of the years past, for example, like our fee setting budget number a couple of years ago, program staff looked at holding a couple of positions, which provided some savings. So this picture here is just basically showing, the full fee setting budget number, and again, the revenues that we're projecting here in the March time period. Are there other questions, Sarah? Email questions?
That's the last email question for now.
Okay, so let's go back to the Zoom. I believe Jared had his hand up. Good morning, Jared.
Good morning. Good to see you, David and John. And thanks for this information. I know we're back here in another year of fees. Kind of returning to the conversation Karen and Sharon were having about the fund reserve. This isn't the most fully developed thought, but just kind of trying to get an understanding of this. I think it seems like maybe isolated, kind of on its face, that 5%, attempt to build up the reserve would be very fiscally prudent. But I think maybe within the context of recent history, it becomes a little bit of a harder proposition, insofar as we've had nearly 40% increases in fees over the last 3 years. So having a year with no fee increases would be very welcome, as that is what we had been accustomed to until very recently. I think also, making a determination as a whole community, of fee payers and the board staff on whether to, kind of alter how fees are collected to help with this issue in mitigating the impacts. It would be far more beneficial to have this conversation once we know where the May revise is, once we know where any BCPs are, because it could quickly become a 5% fee increase to those WDR folks, and then you blink and in August it's a 25% increase. And I don't know if that's going to happen this year, but so as to say there's a lot of unknowns there. I also think to that end, though, Sharon's point about incrementally building up that reserve would be ideal. I also think it's hard to make a decision, on where we stand on this if we don't have details on where the reserve currently is. If the reserve's at 0%, which this kind of is assuming, I think as the fee paying community, we would appreciate a little understanding of where those funds went and how they went in those last few years when the fee increases have been so sharp. Because presumably that reserve could have been going to pay those down, but we were on, kind of under the understanding it wasn't available And so it would be beneficial to know that. I also think that we've heard in the last few years related to ELAPS fees, and I know it's not a one-for-one, but it might provide an analog. These sharp, 10% fee increases at ELAPS program were because fees hadn't been increased, over the preceding years. And so for us in our, position, we're having these sharp fee increases when fees have already been increased. And so I think there's some sensitivity to that as well. And then I think maybe as a last comment for now, the situation with Fizcal, it's been several years at this point, and it's just a little hard to imagine that we don't have that clarity and we don't have a grasp on that when this issue had been raised at least in 2019 or 2020. And I think, if we're having to make a decision about a year where seemingly there wouldn't be any fee increases and we would all be, enlisting to get that fee increase, it would be incumbent to know where Fizcal really is before we do that. And actually one last thought, in terms of how this fund reserve would operate, it hasn't been available in the last few years, but if it were to be, recreated and available for subsequent years, if it's functioning like a prepayment ultimately, where we prepay in this thing to build it up only for it to be used to kind of artificially deflate any one given year increase, I don't think ultimately that's, advantageous or really beneficial to the fee paying community, because it becomes, almost like this rinse, lather, repeat cycle of, we won't have to pay as many fees because we have the fund reserve, but we're going to have to restore that fund reserve back to 5%. And if it just becomes that kind of situation, that would not be preferred. Now, if it was the alternative where it was, we have this fund reserve we built up incrementally, and for reasons we can't control, there's a sharp increase. So we want to use this fund reserve to, eliminate that sharp increase, kind of within the good faith context of there wouldn't be more sharp increases. So subsequent years, I think that's how we prefer the reserve to function. So a batch of comments, again, not the most fully developed or formed, but appreciate the chance to engage early on this and get your guys' input.
All right, thank you, Jared. Appreciate the comments. I think maybe it's Bob Gore has a question.
It's an answer to what Debbie said earlier, and I'm sure Emily, who's apparently next in queue, will elaborate on this. The general fund is a definite vehicle for relieving exorbitant fee increases. The organized way to approach it is to seek what was traditional up until about 2008, which was the statewide benefits of planning, enforcement, and web services, databases, things that the regional boards do, was covered under general fund. We're seeking to return to that, and hopefully in the May revise, we can put together a request that the board will not oppose. As far as Fizcal goes, I will validate what the staff is saying. The state controller's office last week at a budget hearing, since I am a lobbyist, I go to those, testified that Fizcal remains an issue, and that the year-end close statements, they're called coffers, have not been, well, they're 13 months in arrears. It's a critical situation. So that John, David, and others are correct when they say that. If the group wants to look at a possible solution to this, I'd urge them to look at Senate Bill 854 from the 2018 session. It should be self-explanatory. Oh, and by the way, the budget process is not confidential. The BC pre-process is. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, let me jump in really quickly on the Fizcal. We knew it would take 2 or 3 years for us to implement that, and that was just based on the experience of all of our sister agencies. We are now in the 3rd year. We are almost caught up with closing last year's. We should close that in March. And then the way the system works is that we need to close each month subsequently. We can't, in our old system, we could do multiple years, multiple months at one time, but Fizcal is really serial, but it's sort of like a hydra where you chop off one head and two more grow up, but we're now chopping off heads at the rate that we're almost caught up. So David was correct that, pretty soon here, within 3 or 4 months, we should be back to real time, or as real time as Fizcal will allow, which is about 2 or 3 months in arrears. So we should have a lot better data on the both the revenues and the expenditures. And David is correct. We've been kind of flying blind a little bit for the last couple of years, and that was really our main concern in implementing Fizcal, is that we wouldn't have the real-time financial pictures that your accounting system should be providing you. And we knew that was going to be just a byproduct of our changeover from our old system to our new system. So we are getting a pretty good handle on Fizcal now, learning how to use it and catching up in the system. So overall, I think it is good news. We are almost there. We're not quite there yet, but pretty soon we'll have the reports and the numbers that David really needs to calculate these fees. And then to Jared's comments on the use of the reserve. Last year, we obviously had a pretty sharp fee increase, but the year before, we only had a 75% fee increase to what we needed. And the rest of that 25% did come out of the reserve. And in the year before that, we used part of the reserve to offset fee increases. So we have been using the reserve to kind of ameliorate some of these fee increases throughout the years. And I know year to year, it's not obvious because you'd have to go back to the previous year and the year before that to mine the data to see how we were using the reserve to kind of buffer some of these fee increases.
So thank you, John. And before we get to Emily's comments, as John mentioned, there is our accounting office is working close with the Department of Finance on closing the books through Fizcal for fiscal year 2021. If that does happen, then there's an opportunity for me to then go ahead and prepare a fund condition that would show basically 1920, 2021, and then moving into 21-22, showing that more or less on kind of our total budgetary expenditures versus kind of what we projected revenue. And that should show us where we're at least a projected fund reserve, basically going into it for 21-22, and then what it would look like going into 22-23. So I definitely, I see there is some opportunity here moving forward and going back to the way we used to be able to present data. So definitely, and like I said, county's working closely on this, and we're trying to get this done. And again, hopefully at our next meeting in June, I'll be able to provide some type of fund condition. So I believe Emily is next. Good morning, Emily.
Good morning, and thank you. I just wanted to first thank John Russell. So Emily Rooney with Agricultural Council of California, we've been involved in this budget process for quite some time, and we are actually preparing to do a general fund request to help offset foundational costs of the program and also double the reserve. I'm not suggesting we'll get it. It's going to be an ask. We'll see what happens. There'll be an entire political process around that. But that basically comes at the request of our group because our fees continue to increase over time, obviously. And I was not aware, like the other stakeholders, that our reserve had gotten to zero. So I didn't know that we were that close to the bottom, though I know that we do have a history of tapping on the reserve to prevent really drastic fee increases. So I think all of this sort of underscores our need to collaborate to get a general fund request in to help offset some of the foundational costs of the program. I would
David, I'm glad you made that last comment that you'll be able to do a projection on the fund reserve situation in June, because we would be interested in those numbers. And because we want to make this budget request, we would urge you guys to take a very moderate approach in funding the reserve. I would not love this idea of jumping to 5% when we're hoping to get some general fund dollars in to help provide some relief, frankly. But anyway, so John Russell's been helpful in helping me put some numbers together. We're hoping to get a budget request in here soon and hopefully get some relief. But just as a sort of precursor, everybody knows this, but just as a reminder, if even if we're successful in getting general fund dollars, it does not mean that we won't see budget deficits one year and eventually feel pain again. But the idea would be get the foundational costs taken care of if possible and build out the reserve so we have a little more time before we burn through the entire reserve during those times, those tough economic times, which we know we can expect. So anyway, thank you for that.
So thank you, Emily. And I just wanted to respond to one of your comments and then to the group itself. Until I get the reports, I don't know if the reserve is at a 0%. What I am illustrating here, this is just an example. If the reserve was at 0 and the water board is trying to build a 5% reserve, this is that example. There may be, again, when the numbers come through, our reserve may already be at 5%, and so then it allows staff to kind of evaluate this and kind of make a determination. Worst case scenario, I'm just throwing this out here. The reserve may come in the negative by a couple percentages. And if that's the case, then staff would have to evaluate that. Again, I'm not saying that right now the WPF is at a 0% reserve. This is just an example, if it was, what it would take to generate a 5% reserve.
Got it. Thank you.
So let me reach out to staff. Are there any other questions at this point?
Yes, there are two. The first is a comment from Sarah at the, I think it's a Central Coast Water Quality Preservation. I'm just going to read it. Thank you for the meeting and information this morning. As David mentioned, part of the fee setting budget includes redirected costs to foundational state programs such as SWAMP and GAMMA. For the Irrigated Lands Program, this involves the state databases, CDN and GeoTracker. I very much appreciate the CDN staff's willingness to dialogue about the CDN database. However, with both CDN and GeoTracker, those systems have very limited flexibility around data input and very limited and in some cases obsolete platforms for data withdrawal and visualization. In addition, for paying for these programs via fees, we incur additional costs of compliance, which I know is the next agenda item, to develop workarounds to the inadequacies of these systems. We find ourselves needing to pay to redo data analyses when we learn that only 25% of the data we thought we were querying came out of GAMMA. We pay laboratories to make 6,000 uploads to GeoTracker, which they could just as easily do once with any other platform. We pay to develop maps and graphs and other data visualizations of surface water data that our fees are, in theory, paying for CDN to spearhead. I don't know enough about the inner workings of these systems to propose the solution at this time, but this situation is highly problematic from a fee perspective, a cost of compliance perspective, a public perspective, i.e. the environmental and EJ stakeholders who need to see our program's data, and a logistical perspective to running solid monitoring programs that generate useful data. Having these foundational programs funded from the general fund might solve part of the problem, but I think this topic deserves a deeper look.
Thank you. And then as kind of mentioned earlier, Karen Mogus is also going to have a discussion here in a moment on cost of compliance and water quality. And this might be a topic that could be brought up and or again, further discussion.
Okay, and the second question is from Rhonda Schiffman from PG&E. How much of the water quality cert program adjustment, i.e. 19.4% increase, is allocated to subcategory H SB 901 fees and what other 401 cert fees?
So thank you, Rhonda. I know you had reached out to Paul earlier in the week, and of course, we're looking into this. And this goes back to, of course, as you're aware of SB 901, and a couple of years ago, program staff getting, or the water board through a BCP getting 9 positions for this workload. And so we are looking at right now, working with our budget office to determine how much of the cost of those expenditures for those 9 positions. I want to say back a couple of years ago, the proposal was for about $1.8 million. And of course, our costs have gone up. So we're looking at what those costs are. We're also looking at the projects that are subject to the wire fire mitigation under, of course, like you mentioned, category H. We're looking at all those projects and looking at how much revenue is coming into that program. So we're evaluating that, and it is part of the lump sum of the whole water quality certification program. I will say, let me just also add, last year, through our evaluation, that at that time the projects were coming in, we're funding all the kind of projected cost during last year's budgeting cycle. So we're in the process of looking at that currently. So I think there's another question, sir.
Oh, no, that was it.
That was it. Okay. I think Brent has his hand up. Hey, good morning, Brent.
Hey, good morning. First off, thank you. My name is Brent Burchett, San Luis Obispo County Farm Bureau Executive Director. Just want to say a big thank you for the discussion on cost of compliance at a fee meeting. This is a big deal to our, not just our SLO County farmers and ranchers, but across the Central Coast. And we're grateful just to be a part of this and look forward to working throughout the process with you. As others have said, we've seen significant fee increases in recent years, and you can't look at those in a single year, but that cumulative effect, so 10 or 15% really do add up, as you all know that. But it's our smaller farmers that I hear from the most that just simply can't afford this, and these increases do affect our people sitting around a kitchen table trying to calculate how they're going to pay their lease on their ranch that year, and it's really significant. And I want you to consider this in the context of what's probably won't surprise you, what's actually happening on the farm. And I often cite a Cal Poly study. We're in San Luis Obispo, so Cal Poly, 2018 study on the decade of change. So looking at the cost of compliance for a Central Coast lettuce grower from 2006 to 2017, we've seen production costs. Think of your seed, your fertilizer, all that basic stuff that you have to do to produce food has risen about 25%. And you look at the regulatory compliance costs, they've risen about 800%. So just keep in mind that this is the biggest part of our operation. We're talking about supply chain crisis right now and fertilizer inputs, and you all know that. But really, what we worry most about are these type of fees and all the other things that are happening in our economy is such a challenge. This is all, of course, this study was before the Central Coast Regional Water Board, who we work with, the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, also known as Ag Water 4.0. So you know which way those costs have gone. They've certainly increased substantially, and you can see those in detail from the water board themselves. But just a kind of another general comment, as you all engage with California agriculture is a big industry, but what you see in the Central Valley and those discussions you have may not be a match to what we're dealing with here in the Central Coast. So San Luis Obispo County is a lot different than Fresno County. Even the further north you go, that's the makeup of crops. That's also the size of farms, the water challenges. San Luis Obispo County is entirely groundwater dependent for our agriculture system. So we're unique, and I won't belabor the Sigma challenges, a whole nother conversation. But anyway, you heard a little bit from Sarah Lopez with Preservation Inc. And Sarah is on the front lines of this every day. And so we're Farm Bureau, we're covering all these different commodities and different issues. And I've got 2 meetings going on right now on the laptop watching a Senate committee hearing. But please consider what Sarah says on these details. She is, in my opinion, one of the most well-versed people to talk with on how this is actually being implemented on the farms. And you heard a few of those details earlier, but I would just ditto everything Sarah says and what Preservation Inc.'s work does. I believe they're working with about 90% of our farmers that are under the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And Anyway, I'll quit rambling on and just say thank you. We look forward to working with you on this issue.
Hey, thank you, Brent. I appreciate it. I just wanted to add, I also kind of read that study through San Luis Obispo. And definitely I understand all the cost of compliance and those regulatory kind of mandates that you guys are kind of, having to require at all the different farms and things like that, and the costs going up. Definitely one of the things though, that within the report, it's not just the water board, right? It's all the different other agencies and local agencies that are hitting you with the regulatory mandates. And so, when we're talking fees here, those fees don't go towards all of that. There are other fees that you're paying with other state agencies and other local agencies and stuff like that. So, but I definitely appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate you being involved in the process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe Jared was next.
Hi again.
Welcome back, Jared.
Another follow-up question with the fund reserve, and was kind of how is the reserve currently managed or historically been managed? And I guess with the comment being, or the thought being that, if you're raising it 5% per program, we would want to keep that reserve with that program. So if any one year, one program had a sharp increase, you wouldn't want all these other fee payers to have to subsidize that. So I don't know if that's the way it currently is done, or if that's the way this new one is being envisioned or conceptualized at this stage, but wanted to inquire.
Well, I mean, that's, it's an interesting point. I mean, in years past, we do look at all revenue that comes in. And we definitely, we definitely do our best to look at individual programs. For example, like stormwater and land disposal have been programs that have generated additional revenue or revenue that's exceeded their actual program expenditures. So we've taken steps to basically reduce their programs in maybe like one given year. But managing the fund, we do keep that in count. We kind of look at how much money is going into the reserve. But again, kind of as a whole though, when the program has like additional cost, and a lot of these additional costs, again, like things like foundational programs and indirect costs, those are some of the ways that we're able to use this reserve to kind of help offset some of those increases. And there have been, again, it's been several years because, looking at being able to illustrate the fund, but there've been times when the fund has a hefty reserve, and we've taken a proposal to the water board and said, we'd like to reduce our fund reserve by, a couple of percentages and help use that to offset program cost. So we do, again, Jared, we do try to track it individually programs. And we do take some of these proposals to the board when we do have, what we refer to as like a prudent fund reserve. And I hope once we get back to having the reserve, having the fund conditions and better reporting capability through Fizcal, again, we'll be in a better position to track individual program revenues and nailing down the expenditures and having a better projection of where each of these programs fall, and then of course what their share of the fund reserves are. I think it's Willie that has is next in line.
There, can you hear me now, David?
I can. Thank you, Willie. Good morning.
Perfect. Good morning. Thank you for your efforts. So I'm a farmer in the Central Coast, and so I'm concerned about the fees. I'm interested, fees versus cost of compliance. It wasn't that many years ago, our fees were at 12 cents per acre. They're now at $1.30. And it's been 10, 15% per year. It's not the end of the earth from one perspective, but as percentage of cost, it's significant. You heard Brent Burkett from the Farm Bureau. For some growers, that is really significant, less so for others. The importance, though, of irrigated ag to our California economy, I think, is really, really important and is undervalued. You know, it's like our old food pyramid. You know, we're the carbohydrates of the deal. And yes, there's fantastic jobs in Hollywood, and the apps make trillions of dollars. We can't do that if we don't have some really basic inputs in each of our counties, in each of our states. And we've all gone off to university. I went to a swell university, and I'm a liberal Democrat. And yet I can see the value of capturing solar radiation, and especially in these specialty crops in California or in Florida, and turning them in directly into economy. And it's fantastic. It's a lot of money. It's billions of dollars a year. It's real money. But the cost to produce that, all the things that we buy, the people we pay, makes the economy go. It doesn't stay with the farmers. They are not putting gold bars into Switzerland. And these values that we add to the economy and the costs that we pay for all the different compliance, it reflects back on the fees that we have to pay and all the different inputs. And so it's really important for us to really watch these basic budgets. I have a little water board. You know, I have a water district. I have a GSA here locally. You know, we'd like to keep a 20% fund reserve. And if we dip into it, we really have to understand that we've done that and categorize each of those expenses back to where it belongs. So it looks a little disingenuous to me to come back for a 5% increase. You know, all of those expenses that you guys did have justifications. And I totally understand that everything to do in California costs more. And it costs more today than it did last week. But I think it should be categorized in each of the categories and not as like we never had a fund reserve and that here, let's have a fund reserve. No, we had a fund reserve. We had to dip into it. Here's where it went. And here's what we're going to do to get the budget. It just would look better to me to not have column I. It's like a card trick or something. But that isn't the key issue. It's how do we control costs that are really important, you know, at this base unit of a farmer. And then, and you guys are in the same position. It's not like you're taking that fund reserve home and having parties or anything. I know that. So anyway, I just wanted to let you guys know that from our perspective, from my perspective as a farmer who's trying to control costs every day, that has raised, you know, in the years that I've been farming, we were at $3.25 an hour. You know, we're at now $17 an hour for our basic people, our tractor drivers, our supervisors get way more than that. Are not fantastic wages, but they've really gone up a lot. And the prices we get for the products we grow have gone up, but not proportionally. And now the fuel prices and everything else, is you guys have bought gas to get to work today. All of that stuff really comes into play. And that's why I'm here today. This is just one more cost I'd like to control. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Let me reach out to staff here. Do we have any other questions?
There are no other email questions right now.
Let me just take a moment to pause here just to see if any other email questions come in or. So Claire has a question. Good morning, Claire.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Good morning.
Hi, my name is Claire Wyman. I'm the president of the Grower Shipper Association of Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties here on the beautiful Central Coast in Region 3. We represent about 170 members who grow diverse row crops like lettuce, strawberries, broccoli, cauliflower, and wine grapes. We really appreciate the conversation. There's been some great questions, learned a lot today, and also wanted to speak in support of continued engagement of Preservation Inc. on behalf of Central Coast farmers. The Central Coast irrigated agriculture has several unique factors, including, like Brent was saying, we already have incredibly high cumulative costs of growing healthy, fresh produce here on the Central Coast. Again, everything from land rents to, certainly the cost to inputs, certainly the last year, but over a number of years. And then also just want to articulate that we're also mindful of the relatively smaller grower pool for spreading out that cost across the growers as well. So just want to thank you for the dialogue and encourage continued engagement and responsiveness to the comments raised by Sarah Lopez on behalf of Preservation Inc. and Central Coast Irrigated Agriculture. And thank you for the dialogue.
Thank you.
There are no additional email questions.
Okay. So before we move on again to the next item on the agenda, again, I just wanted to highlight that these are numbers based on the governor's proposed budget. Again, the intent of showing the 5% reserve was just an example. So it gives an opportunity to have the dialogue of what a potential that a 5% reserve would look like. Knowing that there's a potential, again, when accounting is able to finalize the books, and I'm able to actually look at the actual numbers, that there may be, a 5% reserve already established. And so then it has an opportunity for my staff and I to go back and rerun the numbers. So I appreciate everyone's dialogue and their comments today. As we can move forward this process in the next coming days or weeks, if you guys have further comments or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Myself and my staff can have some further dialogue. So thank you on that. If we can move to the agenda again, and we'll move to the next item.
So the next item is cost to compliance, but Karen, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and let me know if you're having any issues, then I can share it on my end.
Yay, it worked. I am used to sitting at home. I'm in the office today and I have 3 screens. At home, I only have 1. It's a little easier to deal with. So good morning. I am Karen Mogus. I'm Deputy Director of the Division of Water Quality, and I'm going to talk a bit about cost of compliance for water quality programs at the request of some stakeholders who would like to maintain this conversation as part of our fee discussion, not because they are the same thing, and I'll make clear that they're not, but because we already have these fee meetings regularly scheduled and the same stakeholders interested in cost of compliance participate in our fee discussions. I also want to say, and I'll get to some take-home messages at the end, but really appreciate some of the comments I heard that were very specific about the costs of complying with permits and orders, specifically the one about what it takes to get data into our databases. Really appreciate those kinds of specific comments, because those are the kinds of things that we can dive into and evaluate and try to streamline to reduce costs. So the more that stakeholders can be very specific about costs and where we could attempt to streamline, the easier it is for us to evaluate those and identify solutions. So with that, I'm going to just give you an overview of my presentation. Today, I'm going to give a little bit of background. We've been talking about cost of compliance in a concerted effort since about 2012. So it's been about a decade. And so I'll give a little bit of information about sort of where this started and where we are today, give a definition of what is cost of compliance, an example from the NPDES wastewater permitting program, and then I'll talk a little bit about 3 projects that are currently underway for cost of compliance for the NPDES stormwater permitting program, give a little sort of take-home messages for stakeholders, and then if we have time, open it up for discussion and brainstorming and ideas that we could move forward with on the topic. So as I mentioned, we initiated with a concerted effort in 2012 the discussion of cost of compliance with a water board resource alignment evaluation report. Basically, a lot of what you hear at the fee meetings and the revenues versus expenditures, that really has bloomed from the discussion of this resource alignment evaluation report and being much more transparent about where our revenue comes from and what it's used for. And that really initiated our board's interest in working with stakeholders to evaluate costs of compliance with our regulatory programs. And the goals of the initial effort were to identify, describe, and evaluate opportunities to reduce costs of compliance, to implement plans, policies, and regulations in a manner that minimizes costs while maintaining effectiveness of our regulatory programs, maximizing the utility and benefit of compliance activities, including benefits both to the regulated community and the environment. 4 working groups were formed. It was NPDES wastewater, that stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is why I used the acronym because it would have not fit on the slide. NPDES stormwater, waste discharge requirements, which is our state authority for regulating discharges to land, and irrigated agriculture. And the working groups worked for several months together and documented recommendations in the 2014 staff report to the board. So what is cost of compliance? Just so that we're clear on what we're talking about. It's costs incurred by the regulated community to comply with permits, orders, waivers of waste discharge requirements, or other types of regulatory mechanisms that the water board issues. And these kinds of costs are things like monitoring requirements, special studies or investigations, and reporting requirements. And to be crystal clear, it's not about fees. And so if we're going to talk about cost of compliance, fees are not part of the discussion. Fees are a completely separate animal altogether. And in fact, many stakeholders would argue that the costs of complying with their orders are much more onerous than the fees that they pay into the programs. So I mentioned there were 4 working groups that were formed to look into the specific costs of compliance and identifying some opportunities to streamline. The one that was most successful at the time was our NPDES wastewater stakeholder group. And I'll just say that the stakeholders really drove this process with in collaboration with program staff and regional board staff. It really took a lot of effort on the stakeholders' part to really maintain the conversation and come up with some opportunities for streamlining. So this example comes from a checklist that was developed for state and regional board staff to use when they are issuing an NPDES wastewater permit. And so the checklist goes into these main categories of costs that can be evaluated as the permit is either developed and issued or in the interim while the permit is being implemented. So first is eliminate duplicate receiving water monitoring requirements. And so the questions are regional monitoring feasible? And in many instances, there are regional monitoring programs that have been established to meet regulatory requirements for a consortium of dischargers. And we look to regional monitoring for a number of our programs, including irrigated lands. Region 2 has a pretty robust regional monitoring program for their wastewater facilities, among others. We also look to data collected by another agency may be able to satisfy monitoring requirements. And then, is a collaborative study among multiple dischargers feasible? The second category is reducing monitoring for constituents where the data indicate a positive compliance record. Does the frequency of monitoring, could the frequency of monitoring for a specific constituent with a positive compliance record be reduced, or even reduced usually, probably not eliminated completely. We also want to encourage surrogate monitoring as appropriate. So using surrogates for constituents that may have more expensive analytical methods. So one example is using electrical conductivity in lieu of total dissolved solids. And you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really save us a lot of money. Another more recent example that we're looking at for one of our stormwater permits is using total dissolved solids rather than analytical methods for some organic constituents that we assume and know sorb to sediment. And so using the sediment as a surrogate rather than the organic chemical itself. And then finally, eliminating irrelevant or unnecessary reports and considering other report types. And so this one actually speaks very much to the comment that we heard earlier about the onerous process for getting data into databases and getting the data out once it's in there. Those are great comments and ones that we should be really exploring and considering. So this is an example of just the broad overview of a checklist our staff have access to in order to really evaluate the cost of issuing a wastewater permit. We also have some cost of compliance projects currently underway in the stormwater program, and this is just a summary of them. I can answer questions if anyone has them, but I'll just summarize them here. The first is guidance for municipalities to report costs of implementing stormwater regulatory programs. And so this gets to the data that we need to thoroughly examine what are the costs to a municipality for implementing our permits, and be able to report that to our boards who are making decisions about what requirements should be included in a permit. This builds on some evaluation that was done a few years ago in response to a state audit of costs of compliance in the stormwater program. And we anticipate a report coming out by the end of this calendar year in draft form, and working with stakeholders between now and then to come up with this draft guidance. The second project is guidance for sampling and analysis for use of what we call the biotic ligand model, which is a model that allows us to use water quality parameters to identify whether a constituent, in this case copper and zinc, is more or less toxic in a water body based on the matrix effects in that water body. So that's pretty technical. Matrix effects, when I refer to those, are things like pH and hardness, and things that at different levels cause a metal to be more or less toxic to aquatic life. And so that model allows us to use those parameters rather than having to do a bunch of toxicity tests in order to estimate and establish site-specific water quality objectives for those constituents. And copper and zinc are particularly problematic in stormwater, but we want to recognize that they are not as toxic as the criteria that we use in all waterways. And so using this model will allow us to adjust the thresholds necessary to protect aquatic life, but not be overprotective. And finally, we will be analyzing secondary maximum contaminant levels in our industrial stormwater general permit. In that permit, we are attempting to incentivize, to the degree possible, the infiltration of stormwater to meet water quality objectives. And some of the secondary MCLs are ones that are not necessarily toxic, but are disincentivizing the infiltration of stormwater into groundwater. So those are the 3 stormwater projects we're currently working on. We're also working with CASQA, and Karen Cowan was on earlier. We're working with her to develop a workshop where we can explore more ideas as to how to streamline and make our stormwater permits more effective, both in terms of cost, but also effective in protecting the environment. So here are my take-home messages. Our boards, certainly the State Water Board and many of the regional water board members, support streamlining to reduce costs of compliance, and they want to know when they are putting in requirements in permits, how much does that cost, and what are the benefits associated with those requirements in terms of water quality. And along those lines, we also need to consider the costs of non-compliance. And so when we have discharges that are causing toxicity or causing algal blooms or other issues in our waterways, or increased nitrates in groundwater, those kinds of things, there are huge costs to cleaning those up. And so prevention is worth, a pound of prevention is worth, well, I'm not sure. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cleanup, I guess. We also believe that effective permitting benefits everyone from the perspective of the regulated community, as well as from the perspective of managing our regulatory programs from staff's perspective. So streamlining and being more effective is helpful for everyone. And I want to encourage the regulated community to engage on cost of compliance in the process of development of orders, whether those are statewide orders, which are very few. We have, the industrial general permit I already mentioned. We also have the construction general permit and a few other handful of statewide orders. But many, many more are issued at the regional board level, as you all know. And engaging in that discussion when those orders are in development is going to be most effective. And I recommend that you be as specific and clear as you can. And again, I'll mention the earlier comment about the challenges of getting data into our databases. That's very specific and one that we can clearly evaluate and identify solutions for as we move forward. And ultimately, we would benefit very much from using data to support the recommendations that the regulated community is bringing forth. So with that, this isn't intended to be a big workshop necessarily, but opening up the conversation for questions and discussion and ideas of how we could move this conversation forward. And I guess I'll just facilitate. I see we have one hand up, Charlotte Galluck.
Hi, thank you so much. I appreciate your presentation today. And I apologize if I missed my opportunity earlier. I couldn't find the link and I think it got lost in my spam or something. So I was observing, but couldn't get in. And I just want to highlight a few things in terms of cost of compliance, some of the things that we are working on the ground. And I work for the Kings Water Alliance along with the Kings River Water Quality Coalition. And we are a part of the irrigated ag regulatory program. And we have over 700,000 acres in our coalition. And as you know, the management zones collectively got together with other permitted dischargers to have a boots on the ground effort to comply with the regulations, specifically the CB Salts nitrate control program. And right now we serve over 150 households with bottled water. We have 3 fill stations that produce about 175 gallons per day for folks. And that's walk up. Anybody can use it at any time. So overall, dairy along with irrigated ag is putting together about $1.9 million to have this boots on the ground effort, which is a huge effort, a lot of outreach, and a lot of people talking with folks in rural residents and getting people signed up and testing wells all of that, is part of the cost of compliance here. And then I realize the fees are separate from the cost of compliance, but we are paying about $950,000 right now in fees. And then, it kind of, for our overall acreage, how much of that could we utilize towards these bottled water provisions and getting people actual solutions? And that's kind of the tie-in that I see with fees. I realize it's separate, but there is a tie-in because it is a big chunk that we are providing to the state just in fees. So I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the good things we're doing on the ground to comply with the regulations. And I appreciate the open dialogue and the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob Gore.
Good morning, everybody. Still, just for everyone's consideration for the June meeting, this, in my own favored opinion, and I've talked to Karen about this and others, is a roundtable. It's our opportunity as fee payers to collaborate on cost of compliance, maintenance, and reduction. So like Charlotte had, if for the next convening you have specifics, let's send them in to Karen in advance and we can get them on the agenda. It's a way of continuing to progress instead of just complaining about the fees being too high, actually working together to either keep them at the current level or, God forbid, actually reduce them. In ag lands, for example, CDFA and the new Undersecretary Christy Birdsong are working with Cal EPA to reduce redundancies in permitting, to streamline them, to reduce the burden, in the words of Secretary Ross. And we can do that for all venues, but just come with ideas and specific proposals, like Karen said, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Bob. I don't know if there are any email questions or others with hands up. I don't see any other hands up at this point.
Excuse me, we don't have any email questions for cost of compliance that I can see right now.
I see a hand up. Sarah Lopez, nice to see you.
Hi, Karen. Nice to see you too. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I wanted to thank you and John Russell and the fee branch staff for being willing to include this item on the agenda today of this fee meeting. I really, really appreciate it. This is an important topic to Central Coast agriculture, and I think it's helpful to have a space in which we periodically check in about it or can raise issues for further follow-up. And it doesn't have to be every meeting, or perhaps it could be a round table like Mr. Gore just proposed, but something like a standing annual item, or in this group forum with either individual or smaller group follow-up would be really appreciated. And I agree with you that these fee meetings, though it's a different topic, they do bring together kind of the relevant group of stakeholders, and in some cases, the relevant water board staff. So in addition to the state database topic, which I described in my email comment, some of our other really big cost of compliance factors include monitoring frequency, so that the total number of samples that our permit requires us to take. And that's one of the things that I think these streamlining efforts see by combining the efforts of various regional monitoring programs. I think one of the goals of that is ultimately to reduce the total number of samples that's required of any one program. So I think those can be helpful. I will say we've made a number of those efforts in our region, and they've kind of been foiled by the fact that the ag order monitoring requirements tend to be kind of head and shoulders above other programs. And so we have several other programs that monitor, in some cases, on the same frequency at our same site, and we've been unable to streamline because of inflexibility around kind of a few parameters or minor aspects of the QAP, those sorts of things. And it intimidates the other programs. And so we found it very, very difficult without sort of the involvement and support of the water boards, I don't know that we'll be able to achieve that sort of streamlining. So I hear you when you say that it's kind of on the stakeholders and you need proactive stakeholders to do these things, but I think we also need the support and the collaboration from the water board to achieve that. Another big cost of compliance driver for us is those more expensive parameters. So for example, a pesticide that costs $200, $300, maybe $900 a sample if it's in sediment to analyze versus nitrate that costs only $30, or something with a very, very low detection limit. Detection limits bear very heavily on our costs. And the example that you gave, actually using specific conductants instead of TDS, it sounds like a small thing, but actually that change would save my program 6 figures in the next 60 days if we had that change. So it's not something like that is not insignificant when it's propagated over a large number of samples. And then sort of the last point I wanted to make, other than just, again, thanking you and stressing the importance of continuing this dialogue, is I also wanted to stress, I think you heard a few folks from the Central Coast comment previously today. You heard Brent Burchett from the SLO County Farm Bureau. You heard Willie Cunha, who's a farmer on the Central Coast. And then you heard Claire Weinman, who represents several hundred SLO County and Santa Barbara County farmers. And I think though none of them really dove into all the details of the costs of compliance, I do think they were putting a little bit of a finer point on this distinction between the Central Coast and the Central Valley. And so when the state water board interacts with Central Valley ag stakeholders, we definitely appreciate it. And we definitely acknowledge that some of that feedback that you get is of benefit to the Central Coast as well. However, the Central Coast is a unique growing region. And so it's really important that as you continue these discussions, we make sure that the Central Coast is also at the table so that we can be fully represented. And just one of those differences that also bears on costs is simply the sheer difference in number of acres. So we have 420,000 acres. You just heard from a Central Valley coalition that has nearly double that amount. And then the Central Valley as a whole has 14 times the amount of acres. And so when we look at maybe streamlining programs that are under the same permit, well, Central Coast is under a different permit. And so we can't spread our costs over 6 million acres the way that Central Valley growers can. So these cost discussions sometimes affect the Central Coast very differently. So I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to share these comments, and I look forward to the forthcoming dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate your comments.
Karen, there is an email question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, Paul Souza from Western United Dairies is asking, can dairy farms be included in the efforts to look at cost of compliance? It is significant in the overall cost of water board regulation, and it seems that opportunities exist to streamline the requirements to reduce costs while still achieving water quality goals.
I guess the easy answer is yes. We're always willing and able to have those conversations, again, around the parameters and boundaries that I described in my presentation. So definitely willing to engage in those conversations. I don't see any other hands up. At this point. So with that, I'll just say that we're definitely willing to engage in these discussions. Again, in many instances, it will be more fruitful to engage at the level of the regional board when orders are being developed, or at the state board when orders are being developed in your program area. But we are looking more broadly right now at stormwater issues that impact many different dischargers. And so certainly willing to have the discussions and encourage stakeholders to engage fully as we continue the dialogue.
Thanks, Karen.
Hey, thank you, Karen. I think John just came on. John, do you have a comment?
No, it sounds like we're wrapping up. So I just wanted again to thank everybody for taking an hour or two out of your day today. I know you're all busy to join us here. And again, as David said, this is the first of 3 of these meetings. And as we go further into the budget process, things will start firming up. So the latter meetings will be particularly important to figure out what we're going to be actually taking to the board in terms of a proposal. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, we have these bigger stakeholder meetings, but we're also open to smaller targeted stakeholder meetings. And we do those, we've done those in the past where we meet with specific groups of stakeholders. If you have a specific issue that you want addressed in the fee structure that'll be coming up. For example, we've met with the industrial stormwater group to talk about their fee structure. So if any of you would like that, again, go ahead and reach out to David or I, and we can have some more targeted discussions outside of this larger group as well. But again, thank you all for taking some time to come and join us today.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. David.
So just talking about next steps here, our next water quality fee stakeholder meeting is currently scheduled for June 9th. That's on a Thursday at 9 o'clock. And of course, we'll be sending out information regarding that meeting, prior to the meeting. Handouts and data usually goes out a week prior to that meeting. And this will be based on, of course, the May revised budget. So please just keep your heads up for the May revised budget, and we'll be calculating the numbers based off of that. And again, I just want to end by thanking Karen for her presentation, all the staff that were involved in setting up this meeting and working behind the scenes. And then just thanking all of the program staff and the stakeholders out there. We appreciate all the communication that takes place. With that said, I'll go ahead and end the meeting. And then, as John mentioned, also, please, if there's any further questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of us, and we'll be happy to meet with you. Again, thank you, and everyone have a good day.